Okay, let's unpack this. When most people think about the Cold War, they picture Soviet tanks facing NATO forces across a line in Germany.
Right, the Iron Curtain.
Exactly. But the true global contest, and this is what really shaped the world we live in today, was fought so far away from Europe. It was on the shifting sands of newly independent
It's
nations
absolutely right. The post-World War II wave of decolonization just completely remade the map.
all at once.
Yeah, suddenly you had dozens of new nations, and they often had, fragile political institutions, very weak economies, and contested borders.
Mm.
Our sources show how this immediately transformed every local independence struggle
Into a flashpoint.
into a flashpoint on the Cold War chessboard, yes.
And our mission today is to take a deep dive into America's response to this radical change. It's really a shortcut to understanding a very complex global role.
Hmm.
We need to look critically at the tension. How did the U.S. balance its uncompromising anti-communist goals with its stated commitment to democratic ideals? And, I mean, what were the staggering costs?
Both financial and moral.
Absolutely. The costs of this relentless global interventionism.
And for this, we're drawing heavily on material that focuses on U.S. interventions across Latin America, the Middle East, Asia,
Huh.
and crucially, the intense domestic debate that those actions spark back home about, the true meaning of power and influence.
It's an era that really set the foundation for so much modern foreign policy.
It did.
So let's set the scene. You called it the decolonization battlefield. When these new nations gained independence, what was the primary pitch the two superpowers were making to win their loyalty?
Well, what's fascinating here is the ideological split. I mean, it was so clear. The U.S. championed democratic capitalism, free markets, in alignment with Western institutions like the IMF and the World Bank,
The Western
the
model.
Western model. The Soviet Union countered with authoritarian communism, state-controlled economies, and inclusion within their informal spheres of influence, often through military and political support for revolutionary movements.
But it wasn't just about picking a governing philosophy, though, right? These were incredibly strategic choices, driven by hard assets.
Indeed, these new nations held vital strategic assets. They were valued tremendously for natural resources, oil, crucial minerals, agricultural products,
And location, location, location.
and for strategic geographic locations, exactly, whether it was controlling key waterways in the Middle East or preventing the spread of a rival ideology in Southeast Asia.
So the superpowers would just offer them things.
They'd offer economic aid, military assistance, political recognition. It was all used as incentives. The point is, decolonization wasn't a passive process. It was a high-stakes competition for access and loyalty.
That competition leads us straight to probably the most sensitive region for the U.S., its own hemisphere, Latin America.
Hmm.
Our sources paint a very clear picture of foundational U.S. policy here, and it seems to prioritize anti-communism above, well, everything else.
This is a critical pattern. It defines decades of U.S. policy. The willingness to support authoritarian regimes was, driven purely by the goal of preventing any leftward shift, which was automatically deemed communist.
And this wasn't subtle.
No, not at all. It was established very early on, and perhaps most famously in Guatemala in 1954.
The overthrow of President Jacobo Arbenz. So our sources indicate this was a CIA-backed coup, but what was the specific catalyst that made the U.S. decide to intervene against a democratically elected leader?
The catalyst was economic interests colliding with the perceived communist threat. Arbenz enacted agrarian reform and nationalized these vast amounts of uncultivated land
And that land was owned by who?
by the United Fruit Company, a massive U.S.-based corporation. So the U.S., fearing both the precedent of nationalization and, the rhetoric of social change, authorized a covert operation.
And the consequence wasn't just the removal of Arbenz, was it?
Oh no. That intervention set a devastating precedent. It signaled that U.S. corporate interests and anti-communist paranoia would easily trump a Latin American nation's right to democratic self-determination. A military dictatorship followed, ushering in decades of instability.
So that really set the stage for the true escalation.
Yeah.
Cuba. After Fidel Castro solidified his alignment with Moscow, the U.S. response went from covert manipulation to, well, to outright invasion attempts.
The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 is a major turning point. When JFK sent CIA-trained Cuban exiles, the utter disaster of that operation didn't just fail to overthrow Castro.
It backfired completely.
It actually strengthened the Soviet-Cuban alliance. It pushed them even further together, and this failure escalated rapidly to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
A moment where the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles on the island pushed the entire world to the brink of nuclear war before the Soviet withdrawal. I mean, the stakes just could not have been higher.
They could.
But even after averting global catastrophe, the U.S. continued this policy of undermining leftist leaders, even if they were democratically elected, which brings us to Chile.
Yes, Chile's Salvador Allende, elected in 1970. He was a democratic socialist, so he posed a political threat, not an immediate military one.
Right.
And our sources detailed this relentless U.S. support for the economic and political destabilization of his regime between 70 and 73. This intervention confirmed that the U.S. was willing to spend significant resources, both financial and political, to prevent the rise of any government deemed ideologically hostile.
Even if that required undermining democracy itself.
Exactly.
Now, this strategy sounds like purely hard power, coups and destabilization, but Kennedy also tried a parallel economic approach,
Yeah.
the Alliance for Progress. How did this sort of soft power strategy fit in?
The Alliance for Progress, launched in '61, was JFK's attempt to marry ideals with pragmatism. It was essentially an economic containment strategy.
How so?
It was designed to pump massive development funds into education, healthcare, public works across Latin America. The core objective was logical: reduce the poverty and social unrest that made communism attractive, and you limit its appeal without resorting only to military intervention.
So wait, the U.S. was simultaneously funding hospitals and schools through the Alliance for Progress while actively destabilizing governments like the one in Chile. That must have created enormous internal conflict in U.S. policy.
It highlights the central paradox of the era. They were trying to demonstrate the superiority of the capitalist system through aid, but when a democratic outcome didn't align with their anti-communist goals,
We just defaulted to covert ops.
they relied immediately on covert operations. And those operations often undermined the credibility and the long-term success of the positive development programs.
Okay, shifting gears now. Let's look beyond the Americas to the Middle East and Asia, where the strategic goals took on an added critical dimension: the security of the global energy supply.
Right. Protecting oil resources was paramount, alongside the standard goals of preventing communist expansion and maintaining influence. And the foundational act here was in Iran in 1953.
Our sources call this Operation Ajax. What was the trigger for the CIA-led overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh?
The trigger was, again, nationalization. Oil nationalization. Mossadegh, a very popular nationalist, nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company,
A huge threat to Western control.
a huge threat to Western control over oil flow. So the U.S. saw this not just as an economic attack, but as creating a power vacuum that the Soviets could exploit. The CIA organized the coup to remove Mossadegh.
And the result of Operation Ajax.
The pro-Western Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was restored. This action secured Western access to crucial oil reserves and certified a key anti-communist regime in the region for the next, quarter century.
It cemented the U.S. willingness to intervene to protect resources.
Unilaterally, yes.
So Iran was a clear U.S. victory for its strategic goals. But the rise of leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt showed that these new nations weren't always passive. They learned to leverage the Cold War rivalry.
Nasser was the perfect example of post-colonial agility. When he nationalized the critical Suez Canal, a major strategic route, he angered the West. But Nasser was incredibly skilled at balancing competing offers of U.S. and Soviet aid, military equipment. He was able to consolidate his own power and boost Egyptian nationalism precisely by making both superpowers compete for his allegiance.
He turned the global rivalry into an opportunity for his own nation.
Exactly.
As this rivalry intensified, especially in Asia, we see the U.S. committing vast resources under the umbrella of a single idea: the domino theory.
Yes. That theory became the central justification for massive U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia. After the French withdrew from Indochina, Vietnam was divided. President Eisenhower championed this idea.
That if one nation fell to communism,
Like South Vietnam, then all the surrounding nations in Southeast Asia would inevitably follow, just like falling dominoes.
and that theory justified what sort of financial commitment?
It justified sending over $1 billion in aid to South Vietnam to build up its anti-communist capacity. It was an expensive preemptive move designed entirely to stop perceived communist expansion before it could even start.
And we see this pattern of funding and intervention fueling proxy conflicts even in regions far from Asia, like, say, the Angolan Civil War after 1975.
That conflict is a classic example of Cold War entanglement. The U.S. and South Africa backed opposing factions, UNITA and FNLA.
while the Soviets and Cubans backed the other side.
Right, they supported the Marxist government side, the MPLA. So the involvement of all these external powers just prolonged the internal struggles, turning a civil war into a global proxy battle fought by local populations.
However, our sources do remind us that it wasn't just guns and covert action. Strategic diplomacy had to play a role, right? To stabilize regions where intervention had caused chaos. The Camp David Accords really stand out.
That was a crucial moment. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter successfully mediated peace between Egypt and Israel. These diplomatic successes were vital. They showed the U.S. capacity to act as a stabilizing power, complementing the military strategies by achieving, lasting geopolitical
A
alignments.
peace agreement in a historically volatile area.
Exactly.
Now, this relentless, expensive global commitment to anti-communism, combining aid, coups, diplomacy, it eventually fueled some intense debates about the true cost of power back home. And the first debate was simply about global survival, the nuclear arms race.
The existential threat of the nuclear arms race was, it was the defining feature of the Cold War. The core doctrine, mutually assured destruction, or MAD, was this terrifying paradox.
A paradox that kept the peace, in a way.
It deterred direct conflict, yes. Because both the U.S. and the Soviet Union knew that a full-scale nuclear war would guarantee the destruction of both sides. There would be no winner.
So the threat of total destruction is what kept the peace. It sounds insane, but it forced both sides to the table, didn't it? It led to strategic diplomacy like the SALT II and SALT II treaties in the 70s, which negotiated limits on nuclear stockpiles to manage that risk.
Managing the nuclear threat shaped everything, from budgets to public consciousness. But there was another, more subtle danger arising from the Cold War structure that a U.S. president warned about in his 1961 farewell address: the military-industrial complex.
And here's where it gets really important, because the source of this warning was Dwight D. Eisenhower, a former five-star general, a Republican president, not who you'd expect.
Not at all.
What exactly was the nature of the threat posed by this military-industrial complex, or MIC?
Well, Eisenhower defined the MIC as the profound and potentially problematic relationship between the armed forces and the vast network of private defense contractors. He warned that this fusion of enormous military need and enormous industrial capacity could acquire undue, unwarranted influence over government policy.
The fear was that, and that single-minded focus required the U.S. to repeatedly make choices that compromised its core democratic ideals abroad.
Oh, absolutely.
Whether it was overthrowing the elected leader in Guatemala or destabilizing a socialist democracy in Chile.
It reveals a profound tension at the heart of the Cold War. The means often conflicted with the stated ends.
Which leaves us with the final provocative question that kind of synthesizes our entire dive. Given the U.S. willingness to compromise democratic ideals abroad to combat communism, and Eisenhower's dire warning about the threat of the military-industrial complex influencing democracy at home, where did the true threat to American democratic values ultimately lie during the Cold War, in the aggressive actions of the Soviet Union, or in the, let's say, necessary actions taken by the U.S. to counter them? Something for you to consider as you process this history.